I'm not sure if this is a rug or a mat. I would call it just a mat. I believe it may be the type of rug that you would have bought carpet tacks and tacked around the edges of it because it's so thin. This is more of a floor covering than a rug. When I was, I would say in the mid 1980s, this rug was in the home of Ms. Bertha Ingram. She was our neighbor. And when Ms. Ingram broke up housekeeping and went to the nursing home, she gave me this rug out of her house. And she gave me the history of it as well at the time. She told me that this rug had been purchased by she and her husband around 1928, I believe. They married in 1924. And in 1928, I believe she told me that Miss Janie O'Neill broke up housekeeping herself and sold them this rug. Well, Miss Janie O'Neill was the daughter of Marshall O'Neill. And Miss Janie told her that this rug had been in her parents' house. And, you know, everybody around here knew the Marshall O'Neill home and where it stood. The house stood on the Harris and Talbot County line on Highway 208. The old home was torn down in the early 1960s, but the site now was later, there was a pool hall there called Don's Pool Hall, and it was on the outer edge of Melody Lakes, just outside Waverly Hall. But the Marshall O'Neill home was built sometime, I believe in the late 1820s by John Kennan. And when Mr. Kennan, when his estate sold, the Marshall O'Neill family moved there. And I believe they bought the place sometime in the 1830s or the 1840s. Well, Judge Marshall O'Neill, he later became a justice of the peace, and he lived there in that house and died there in 1885. And I believe his grave marker in the cemetery says that he was 70 years old at the time. So he was born about 1815 and died in 1885. Well, this was his rug, and Miss Janie told Miss Bertha Ingram that this came out of the parlor. Well, Miss Bertha told me that the rug was in perfect condition when she got it, that Miss Janie really treasured it, and Miss Bertha took it to their house and put it in a bedroom. And the center of the rug was always in really good condition because the bed sat right here, and the entrance from the hallway into that bedroom at Miss Bertha's house came right across. When you entered the bedroom, you walked across the foot of this rug and around the side of it to get on the bed. Well, that is where you can see the area of traffic where it is worn so bad. The rest of it was underneath the bed all that time and was pretty well protected. But when I took the rug up, I put it in storage, and it stayed in storage probably 10 years, 15 years. And then I got it out in 2003, I believe, and put it in the dining room at our house here. So it was in our dining room up until just before Thanksgiving. Jennifer, my wife, decided that she wanted to just have bare floors in there because all of our floors are refinished at our home. And she wanted to enjoy the floors for a while, and she said the rug has got to go. So we patched the rug over the years with just some, basic carpet tape on the back side. We never did anything major to it, but the rug is at least it was in the O'Neill family at least in 1885 when Mr. O'Neill passed away, and I would imagine that it was in there a long time before that. I went on to find a grave the other night, was looking at the O'Neill graves here in Waverly Hall, and I found an interesting obituary on one of Mr. O'Neill's grandsons who passed away in 1892, I believe. Yeah, he passed away in Richmond, Virginia in 1892, and he was brought back to Waverly Hall to be buried. And the mayor of Richmond, Virginia, not Richmond, Virginia, Richmond, Indiana. The mayor of Richmond, Indiana accompanied his body back to Waverly Hall, and he described the O'Neill residence at that time. Waverly Hall is the homestead of the O'Neill family near Columbus, Georgia. The family appears to have been a very prominent one in Georgia, and before the war lived like princes of the realm. The war wrecked their fortune, but they saved enough out of the wreck to still leave them one of the finest homesteads in the South, which is kept up in good style. So from that, we know that the O'Neill residence was a very nice one, up until probably, I think it was pretty run down by the 1950s, and it was torn down. I do remember my parents describing it, that it was a story-and-a-half type house with a big porch across the front with square columns, and that it had a plastered wall on the front porch, the way that some of the old southern homes had. But anyway, that's the history of this rug. It went from the O'Neills to their daughter, Janie O'Neill Robertson, to Miss Bertha Ingram, to me, and now to you here at the Byrd Farm.
That's right. And when did you say that Miss Bertha Ingram acquired the rug?
She got it, I believe, she said that she married in 1924, and I believe that she went to Miss Janie's, Miss Janie was having a sale selling some things around 1928.
Gotcha.
And that was about the time that she acquired it. But she told me that Miss Janie was, that it was a treasured item in the family, but Miss Janie had no children. And her sister Mary had no children either. So Mary had died, and if I'm not mistaken, I think Janie and Mary lived together, and Miss Mary was married to Barney Robertson. And when Mary died in 1917, I think Miss Janie married Barney. I believe they married one another and continued living in the house together up there by the city hall. There's a business in that house now called the Earthly Emporium. So the house that they lived in, that they moved from the Marshall O'Neill farm, they moved into Waverly Hall, and that's where they lived out their days. But for whatever reason, Miss Janie was selling everything and breaking up housekeeping, maybe going to live with someone else in the family, I'm not sure. But she sold everything she had, and this was one of the items. And it is an American-made rug. It's not anything from overseas, I don't think. It is made of wool. It probably was not an expensive rug at the time that it was made. It's got a manufacturing number on the back of it. It was probably ordered from some catalog. But it's an old Waverly Hall relic.
All right, so in here, Dan, I have several books that you'd given me that came out of the old Waverly Hall library that you had rescued. And tell us a little bit about that, the old library.
Well, Waverly Hall had a public library, I believe, that was put together sometime in the late 1940s. It was once the WPA built the community center uptown, one of the wings had a little addition built onto the back, probably about 5 years later, and they put a little library in there, and they asked citizens to donate books. And the old Waverly Hall School, which had been the Nanny Schley Institute before it was became Waverly Hall Public School, the old library from there had been moved into the Waverly Hall High School, and that had been moved into the public library also. Well, the public library closed probably in the early 1970s, and over the years people just went there and helped themselves to whatever they wanted. It wound up being a storage area for the town maintenance department. There was shelves of books here on one side, and right in front of that would have been spare water meters and parts, and no parking cones, and just construction debris. And when the roof started leaking on that little addition, all of the library books were moved upstairs over the old fire station. And later, bats got into that area, and the bat debris in there was just unbelievable. But anyway, when the old fire station was renovated, the books were all cleaned out, and I went up there when they were going through all the books, throwing them away, and there must have literally been almost a dump truck full of books. And we rescued a lot of the good books out of there that were still clean. Those were moved over to what's now a library in the current City Hall building. And it's just a little borrowed honor system library that we have going. But anyway, those books that were salvageable were moved. And these are the books that wound up in the garbage. Well, I rescued a few of them out of the garbage, and they've just been sitting in my garage all this time. And and I thought you might find some interest in some of these to add to your room of memorabilia here. You can tell a lot of these are very insect damaged, but that was from long ago. There's no insects in them now. And most of those are just general run-of-the-mill books, but this one right here was pretty interesting. This one was The Life of General Nathan Bedford Forrest, and you can see the damage that was done when it was in storage in the old building, in the old library building. But this book had been donated at some point to the library by the family of the original owner. The original owner of this book was Major J.A.H. Granberry, Waverly Hall, Georgia. He purchased this book in November of 1911. And later it became the property of the Waverly Hall Public Library. Well, this book, having belonged to Major Granberry, Major Granberry's, let's see, he married a lady named Mary McKee, and she was known as Molly McKee. Major Granberry married her, and they lived in the house that was, in other words, Mrs. Molly Granberry sold her house to the Ingram family, the same house that this rug was in all those years. Molly McKee, after Major Granberry died, she sold the house to the Ingram family. And Mr. Kurt Ingram and Miss Bertha Ingram lived there until his death, and then Miss Bertha lived there until she went to a nursing home, and then the house was torn down, and that's where the little restaurant building is up between the city hall and the grocery store now. But anyway, Major Granberry was buried in Bethesda Baptist Church Cemetery on the hill back in the woods. We went there a couple of years ago and did a video.
And that was for reference sake, that was a cemetery that would have been destroyed by a tornado.
That's right. Basically. That's right. The tornado of 1875 did come through that cemetery and turned over a lot of big headstones. But Major Granberry was buried there in his cemetery lot, or his family's cemetery lot, but his wife, Molly, was buried over in her family's cemetery lot. Now, Molly was a first cousin to the Byrd brothers, James Henry Byrd, and Mr. George Archie Byrd. Molly was their first cousin. She was also a sister to Mr. Will McKee, who was a very wealthy cotton buyer. And Mr. McKee, he came to Waverly Hall, and he built a big store here when the railroad came through, just like his cousins, Mr. Byrd and his brother George Archie did. Now George Archie being the cotton farmer, and James Henry being the merchant. But Mr. Will McKee moved on. He lived in Midland, Georgia, just down south of here, on the railroad track there, and or had his home close by the railroad, and he became quite wealthy. And he lived his life out in Midland. But anyway, this book being in the library, we were looking at this. Looks like it was only checked out once, and that was in May of 1940. It was checked out by Mullins Wisnant. Now, Mrs. Molly McKee Granberry, after she sold her home, she lived with the Wisnants. She rented a room in the house with them. And you just did a video not long ago where Lisa carried you on a tour of the old Wisnant home. And that is where Mrs. Granberry lived. She lived there, I think, a couple of years with them, renting a room there, kind of boarding in the house, you know. And then she moved on over, I believe, maybe with some of her brother's family, because she did not have children. But this had been her book, her husband's book, and she probably was the one who donated this to the Waverly Hall Public Library. But I thought it was neat that Judge Wisnant checked this book out in 1940 and returned it, and was probably the only one who ever read it after that. The Life of General Nathan Bedford Forrest.
Now, what can you tell me about Major Granberry? You had about his life. What was his story?
When Major Granberry lived here in Waverly Hall, the people that I knew who remembered him said that he was quite a character. He did enjoy retirement. He enjoyed sitting around in front of the old stores on a bench, hanging around the stores, around the potbelly stoves and so forth, and telling stories of the war. He entertained children with his stories, he entertained adults, he really entertained anyone who would listen. And whenever there was any special occasion, such as, I don't know, the 4th of July or something like that, on the Sunday closest to that, he would always wear his original Confederate uniform to church. And he was quite well known for that. It was not, as I was told, it was not a reunion uniform. It was not something that he ordered through the mail as something new that, you know, some of the guys, they would order new uniforms and wear them to the reunions in Macon and Columbus when they would have those. This was an original, and he kept it well pressed in a box in his cedar chest at home, and on special occasions he would get that thing out and put it on and wear it. And I was told once that he was buried with that uniform on, but I don't want to say that he was or wasn't, but I have heard that he was. I don't know if that's true or not. Dated 1902, and these were 1900 or 1901, I think. Yeah. Okay. Years and years ago, I was able to get into the old Pitts building here in Waverly Hall and clean out the loft that was up over the front windows of the store. The Pitts building was an old mercantile business, and the building where it was last housed was built in 1902. And Mr. Pitts didn't throw anything away. He was the old merchant, and he saved every little scrap of paper that came into the store because he would reuse them to write things on, write notes to the other people that worked in this big place, because he had the store and the warehouse and the cotton gin and the fertilizer plant and all in the lumber yard. And the only way to communicate back in those days was to write a note to each other. So he saved every little scrap of paper. Well, all these little scraps of paper were dumped into a loft that was above the display windows of the store. And sometime in, I'd say, early 1980s, Mr. L.D. Reeves, who was the owner of the building at the time, he told me that these papers were up in that area and told me I could have them. He said, if you want to climb up there and get them down, they're yours. So Mr. Reeves let me climb up in there and get all these papers. Well, Mr. Pitts had originally strung these papers up in little bags, and he had some on strings. He had saved every receipt for everything that ever came into the store. And I got up there and got all these down, and a lot of them, you know, wound up going just disintegrated into nothing but dust. But these are some of the ones that I found, that I went through recently and found for you. This was Mr. George Archie Byrd, Waverly Hall, Georgia, and this was from Blanchard, Humbert and Company in Columbus. They were cotton buyers back in the old days, and this one was post-dated 1902. All right, this is where Mr. George Archie Byrd sold 18 bales of cotton to Blanchard, Humbert and Company. Now, it went through their Alabama warehouse, which, you know, this was all on the Chattahoochee River, of course. Cotton would have been purchased there or shipped down river to Pensacola and then, you know, carried on away from here. But anyway, he sold 18 bales of cotton. These are the numbers, the weight. This says private marks. I don't know what these codes are for, different weights. These may be the initials of the people who weighed the cotton. But anyway, these are the bales individually. 440 pounds, 370 pounds. There's one for 500 pounds. I think the largest one here was 602 pounds. And then right here it says, we have sold this at 7 3/8 except for one bale was 7. And I'm thinking that that's 7 3/8 cents a pound, and one bale brought 7 cents a pound. If you think about 18 bales of cotton and each one weighing what this amounts to, if you can imagine a handful of cotton, what that weighs, it weighs literally nothing. By the time you pick enough cotton, if you pick this entire room full of cotton and you compressed it all into a little square, you could hold it in the palm of your hand and it probably wouldn't weigh 7 ounces. You can imagine how much it takes to weigh a pound, And if you can imagine how much it takes to weigh 602 pounds, that would be a lot of cotton. And we're not talking about the kind of cotton that they grow nowadays where they fertilize the land and cotton stalks grow head high and they run over it with a combine and collect it and leave half of it scattered about the field. This was cotton that was low growing. It was hand picked, and that took a lot of cotton to weigh that much. But anyway, those 18 bales, it doesn't say how much they brought, but there is another. This one was dated 1902, and these are dated a little earlier, I believe. Let's see, that is a deposit slip, and then this one is also from the same company. This is from Blanchard Humber and Company in Columbus on the Chattahoochee River. To George Archie Byrd, G.A. Byrd, Esquire, Waverly Hall, Georgia. Dear Sir, we have deposited proceeds of 13 bales of cotton in the Third National Bank to credit of I.H. Pitts and Son. Your directions were for 6 only, but we suppose that you are to take the same direction. Yours truly, Blanchard Humber and Company. And that was September 13th, 1900. So this time he sold 13 bales of cotton, and here's the current market price. Market price at the time, it says firm. Good middling was 10 7/8. Strict middling was 10 3/4. Middling was 10 5/8. Low middling was 10 1/2, and good order was 10 1/4. Those were the different grades of cotton there. But so in 1900, cotton was bringing 10 cents a pound, and then by 1902, it was 7 and some odd cents a pound. But anyway, you can see where Mr. Byrd did a lot of scribbling on the back of this, figuring the amount that was put in the bank for those 13 bales of cotton. And here's the deposit slip from the Third National Bank, September the 15th of 1900. They made this account deposit out to I.H. Pitts and Son, $248.46. That was a lot of work, a lot of cotton to amount to $248.46. Of course, that was a lot of money then. But you know, we think about the cotton, and sometimes you think, oh, these folks made a fortune, but that was a good bit of money. But you know, with the broad scope of things, it was not a lot of money for what all they had to put into that. And also, you kind of wonder. I asked Miss Margaret Pitts one time about this, and she said that Mr. Byrd and her father were partners at one time in the cotton buying business, but they deposited all of this in Mr. Pitts' account, and I thought it was kind of strange that they said it's all going the same direction. So you got to wonder, did Mr. Byrd buy some land from Mr. Pitts, and maybe this was his way of paying Mr. Pitts off, was through this sale of these bales? I really don't know. But anyway, another interesting piece of Byrd farm history.
Now, these were, you touched on this briefly, that George Archie Byrd and Mr. Pitts had gone into the cotton buying business together. Yes. Because of his brother, George Archie's brothers, James Henry Byrd, who built this house, and he would have been technically a competitor of Mr. Pitts. Is that correct? They
were competitors of Mr. Pitts at one point. The Byrd brothers owned their own cotton gin here. It was on the corner of McCullough Drive and Story Drive, where the little brick house is that Mr. Beverly Reeves owned. That was where the the Byrd cotton gin was located. And the Byrds had a cotton warehouse that was underneath the water tank that burned probably in the mid or early 1980s. We do have good pictures of that, but we don't have any pictures of the cotton gin. But the Byrds and the Pitts were at one point strict competitors with one another, and but this was in the early 1900s that Mr. Byrd, or Mr. George Archie, was apparently doing some kind of business with Mr. Pitts in the cotton business. So Miss Margaret Pitts was Mr. Will Pitts' daughter. She lived to be 104. And when I interviewed her about that, she just said that she remembered it as a young girl that Mr. Archie and her papa did business together in cotton. So there's what evidence of that is left.